Greetings! Thank you for tuning into this presentation on how to evaluate news sources. Today I'm going to talk about sorting through all the news you encounter to find what is factual and what isn't. Why am I qualified to give you this presentation, you ask? Well, I'm a librarian with a master's degree in library science. Librarians are trained to not only find good books, but also how to research and evaluate information for relevance and factualness. As a credentialed librarian, I'm going to share with you some of the skills that librarians use to curate our news. I hope you enjoy it and come away feeling empowered to sift through the news and discard what isn't accurate and truthful. The first thing I'm going to talk about is bias. We hear a lot about how the media is biased, but what does that mean? Well, in short, it's how journalists and news producers select events and stories and how they're going to cover those events and stories. According to the website allsides.com, a news media fact checker, which I highly recommend, 72% of Americans believe that traditional news sources purposely report false or misleading information. While some news sources do purposely mislead or falsely report news, there are others that try to put their own biases in check to share news as neutrally and as factually as possible. First, let's talk a little bit about our personal biases. Yes, we all have them. These are the biases that we all have, and they influence how we perceive the news. There are many kinds of bias that affect how we view the world, but I won't go into all of them. Just the most common. The top three are explicit bias, which is when we're aware of and openly admit to a bias. Think openly admitting to disliking another race or religion. Implicit bias, which is when we aren't aware of a bias, but it's still there, influencing our perceptions and behaviors. Think of believing yourself to be an egalitarian, but at the same time, kind of afraid of certain other ethnic groups. Then there's confirmation bias, which is when we find information and news that confirms what we already believe, even when there's evidence that disproves our beliefs, and we ignore that evidence. Or we only look for information that confirms what we believe. This one is really, really common and results in people creating information silos on social media, so all of their news is from a few extremely biased sources. Depending on where you look, there are anywhere from 6 to 11 identified media biases. I'm going to use the 11 media biases identified by allsides.com. We'll also look at the examples they use to identify these biases because they offer some really great examples. The biases we'll look at today are spin, unsubstantiated claims, opinion statements presented as facts, sensationalism or emotionalism, mudslinging or ad hominem, mind reading, slant, flawed logic, bias by omission, omission of source attribution, and bias by placement. Spin is a form of media bias that clouds your views and prevents you from getting a precise take on what actually happened in the event being covered. It often uses sensational words and phrases to stir emotions. Some words and phrases to look out for that indicate spin would include high stakes, monumental, tirade, latest in a string of, turn up the heat, facing calls to, decrying. Notice the underlined words in this example of spin and media bias. Appeal to the American president's vanity, ornery outburst, berated, complained, endured, churlish temper, shaken by his especially foul mood. The Washington Post, which leans left politically, uses a variety of dramatic, sensationalist words to spin the story to make Trump appear emotional and unhinged. They also refer to the president's vanity without providing supporting evidence. Sometimes journalists make claims without including evidence to back them up. Statements that appear to be fact but do not include specific evidence are a key indication of unsubstantiated claims bias. Look at the underlined phrase to see the unsubstantiated bias in this example. If America's household wealth were distributed evenly across the population, then every family of 4 would have a net worth of $1.2 million. In this article from Washington Post, the columnist makes a claim about wealth distribution without noting where it came from, but leaves us to wonder who determined this number and how. Sometimes a news outlet will use subjective terminology under the guise of reporting objectively. This use of subjective language indicates the journalist's personal opinion, even though it is presented as fact. Some words and phrases that indicate subjectivity in the report could include, "It's likely that," "seemingly," "suggests," "may mean that," "possibly," "apparently." Objective statements, on the other hand, are observations of observable facts, and they can be empirically proven or disproven. The underlined sentence in this article opens an opinion stated as fact. Her appearance on the friendly show may be another sign that she intends on staying relevant prior to 2020. In this Fox News article about Hillary Clinton's appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, the author makes an assumption about Clinton's motives and jumps to a subjective conclusion. Fox News Online, by the way, leans right, while their opinion pieces skew hard right. Sensationalism or emotionalism is a type of media bias in which information is presented in a way that gives a shock or makes a deep impression, producing a strong emotional response from the reader or viewer. Some words used to indicate the report is sensationalist could include scathing, lashed out, chaotic, screeched, desperate, explosive. The red underlined phrase here sensationalizes an upcoming election as a bloodbath. Here, BBC, a normally neutral news source, uses sensationalism in the form of hyperbole, as the election is unlikely to involve any bloodshed in the literal sense. Mudslinging is when unfair or insulting things are said about someone to damage their reputation. Similarly, ad hominem, which is Latin for to the person, attacks are attacks on a person's motives or character instead of the actual content of their argument or ideas. The title of this Reason article uses ad hominem to discredit another journalist. The reporter calls a New York Times columnist a snowflake after the columnist emailed a professor and his provost to complain about a tweet calling him a bedbug. For clarity, Reason is a right-leaning news source. Mind reading occurs when a journalist assumes they know what another person thinks. The journalist may also assume that the rest of the world views the situation the way they do. Notice the underlined phrases in this CNN online news piece. Hatred of looking foolish. Democrats' conviction that they have a winning hand. We can't objectively measure that Trump hates looking foolish because we can't read his mind or know what he is feeling. There is no evidence provided to demonstrate that Democrats believe they have a winning hand. CNN News is left-leaning, while their opinion pieces are hard left. Slant narrows the scope of our understanding of a story because journalists tell only part of a story. This can include cherry-picking information or data to support one side. This prevents readers from understanding the full story. In this example from Fox News, she, along with Sanders, has received intense criticism for policy proposals like the Green New Deal. Fox News notes that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's policy proposals have received intense criticism. Well, this is true. It's only one side of the picture, as the Green New Deal was received well by other groups. This is an example of the slant the writer takes in presenting the news. Flawed logic can involve jumping to conclusions or arriving at a conclusion that doesn't follow from the premise. There is frequently no evidence to support the conclusion. Here, the Daily Wire, which skews right, interprets a video to draw conclusions that aren't clearly supported by the available evidence. Notice the underlined terms: snubbed, refusing to shake her hand, awkward and bitter nod. The video they talk about shows Melania did not extend her hand to shake, but it could be because Clinton was too far away to reach, or perhaps there was no particular reason at all. The reporter's logic here is flawed. Media outlets sometimes omit stories in order to serve whatever political agenda they subscribe to. Sometimes a story will only be covered by media outlets on a certain side of the political spectrum. This is from a piece titled, "Hate Crimes Are Rising, Regardless of Jussie Smollett's Case." Here's why. CNN claims that hate crimes incidents rose for 3 years, but omits information that may lead the reader to different conclusions. According to the FBI's website, reports of hate crime incidents rose from previous years, but so did the number of agencies reporting, with approximately 1,000 additional agencies contributing information. This makes it unclear as to whether hate crimes are actually on the rise, as the headline claims, or simply appear to be because more agencies are reporting. By omitting relevant information, the journalist exhibits biases. An informative, balanced article should provide the background or context of a story, including naming sources. Sometimes reporters will use general terms without indicating who the source actually was. This should be looked on with skepticism because reputable journalists should name their sources. In this paragraph, the Epoch Times, which skews hard right, repeatedly states, "Critics say," without telling us who those critics are. A reputable journalist would indicate who those critics are so the readers could come to their own conclusions. An editor's viewpoints are apparent by where they place their top news in the newspaper or webpage. The stories that a media outlet features prominently on its homepage and in print show which stories they really want you to read, even if you read nothing else on the site or in the publication. These examples of two different news sources from the same day indicate what the editors want people to read and what the editors think is important news. We can see that the left-leaning New York Times prioritizes some news, while the right-leaning Reason prioritizes others. By now, I'm sure you're asking yourself, now I know how to spot media biases, but is there a tool to help me? Why, yes, there is. There are a couple of different media bias charts available online. The one you see here is from allsides.com. You can find the other one from adfontasmedia.com. Both are quite good and explain their ratings and the reasoning behind them. There's also consistency in how they rate their different news media sources. So you can check them against each other, but you'll see pretty much the same thing from both. Well, this chart doesn't show all of the available news sources out there. It shows the most popular. Is your favorite news source on this chart? Where does it lie? Is it left-leaning, hard left, right-leaning, hard right, or centric? For a balanced, neutral perspective, try to curate your news sources from the middle purple C column and maybe branch out with one in the right and left-leaning columns. But stay clear of the hard left and the hard right. Those news sources are very, very biased and quite often not very accurate. Now that you know how to spot media bias, here are a few more tips to make you a connoisseur of news. Practice asking yourself these questions when you read or see a news or article. Who's the source? Remember those biases we just covered? Read beyond the headline. Headlines are there to grab your attention. Maybe the whole story is entirely different. Check the author. If there's no author attributed, be wary. A reputable reporter will be happy to have his or her name attached to an article. What are the supporting sources? Are there any? Check the date. Is this an article from 5 years ago that is being recycled? Is it a joke? Sometimes satire articles trick us into believing they're real news. Check your own biases. Remember the implicit, explicit, and confirmation biases I talked about earlier? Ask the experts. When in doubt, ask your local librarian or check a fact-checking site. Speaking of which, these are some wonderful fact-checking sites to check your news against. Snopes is known as the definitive internet reference source for urban legends, folklore, myths, rumors, and misinformation. Lead Stories uses the Tendrilizer engine to detect and debunk the latest trending fake news stories and hoaxes found on known fake news sites and networks, prank generators, and satirical websites. Media Bias Fact Check, or MBFC News, founded in 2015, is an independent online media outlet. MBFC News is dedicated to educating the public on media bias and deceptive news practices. Allsides.com. Their mission states, by providing balanced news, issues, and civil dialogue from all sides of the political bias spectrum, All Sides heals polarization and improves our democratic society. Fact Check. Their mission says, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit consumer advocate for voters that aims to reduce the level of deception and confusion in U.S. politics. We monitor the factual accuracy of what is said by major U.S. political players in the form of TV ads, debates, speeches, interviews, and news releases. PolitiFact. Their mission says, PolitiFact is a fact-checking website that rates the accuracy of claims by elected officials and others who speak up in American politics. The Washington Post Fact Checker is from columnist Glenn Kessler, who focuses on the accuracy of statements of political figures regarding issues of great importance, be they national, international, or local. Vote Smart checks voting records, background, and public statements of candidates from around the country. And then there's good old Google image search. For when you suspect an image might be faked, just copy and paste it in your search engine, and it'll tell you. Now you have the tools to be a pro at evaluating the news. Remember, be skeptical of bias, curate your news sources to the most neutral and balanced reporters, and make use of the fact-checking resources out there. Remember, the library is a good fact-checking resource too. You can call us and we'll be happy to find out if your news was fact or fiction. Happy news evaluating!